Ever since Joan of Arc Prime has come into the game, we've spent a lot of time on this channel studying her, how to best use her, and how to maximize the value you are getting out of this new legendary commander. But in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to use her as a primary commander if you're in that situation. So stick around. What's up, everybody? Second here in the Rise of Kingdoms video. I've talked a lot about Joan of Arc Prime and how to use her in a variety of situations. Most recently, I've been doing a lot of analyses of rage and rage optimizations with commanders like Nevsky and XY as the primary commander. I'll leave a card at the top for those videos, and you can check those out after this one finishes. But I've been getting questions about how to use Joan of Arc Prime as a primary commander. Now, I want to start out by saying a couple of things here. In some previous videos when I've talked about Joan of Arc Prime, I've suggested you probably shouldn't use her as a primary commander. She is probably better suited or best suited as a secondary commander to a commander like Nevsky, which I think is the #1 cavalry march in the game. Nevsky with Joan of Arc Prime as the secondary, or with XY if you are using your Nevsky on another march like Nevsky William. XY seems to be a really good primary commander as well. And I've shown in my previous video just how powerful that can be in terms of the skill cycling with those two commanders together. But there are some occasions where you might want to use Joan of Arc Prime as a primary commander. Now, to be clear here, I'm not talking about Sunset Canyon or Lost Canyon, where obviously it doesn't matter. Of course, you could use her. I'm really talking about KVK kinds of situations. You can use Joan of Arc Prime and Ark of Osiris too, where maybe it doesn't matter so much. You're not that worried about her getting targeted. But in KVK situations, it's probably not the best commander to use as a primary for a couple of reasons. One is that with a commander like Nevsky, for example, if you use him as the primary, you're getting this 4th skill, which triggers an extra 35% skill damage for 4 seconds. And when Joan of Arc casts Sacred Banner, you're getting that bonus, which is an AoE skill damage of Sacred Banner, right? So it's from this blessed here. You're getting that on both this one, which is AoE, and then the blessed part, which is another AoE. So you're getting this skill twice, and you're getting a 35% skill boost, which actually, because Nevsky automatically boosts skill by 25% anyway, you're getting a 60% skill damage boost on that double AoE. And I think in field fighting, that's really what you want. You want the Nevsky to be primary. I can imagine some situations where you say, hey, look, I'm fighting a single target. And in those situations, yes, you're probably going to benefit from having the Nevsky as the secondary because you're getting that skill boost to a much higher skill damage factor here. So in those situations, maybe it is better to have Joan of Arc as the primary. But in most open field battling situations, murder ball kind of situations, Nevsky with Joan of Arc is the way to go for that reason. And with XY, of course, it really does make sense to use XY as the primary, mostly because of this rage, the 900 rage requirement plus another 50 reduction here. You're just going to be firing off those skills so much faster, as we showed in another video, with XY as the primary commander. So I really don't think it makes sense to have Joan there. The other thing is that the skill tree is actually a pretty good talent tree. And so both Nevsky and XY offer the skill tree, whereas Joan of Arc offers a support tree. Now, I know a lot of people are big fans of the support tree, and there are some reasons to like it, but it used to be more popular before we knew how raged worked. And a while back ago, we thought, oh, wow, the support tree is so good because it has this talent here, Rejuvenate, and this Rejuvenate in the support tree gives 150 rage when you have 3 points in it. We went, wow, that is a lot of rage compared to the Rejuvenate in the skill tree, which only gives 60 rage. And so it seemed like this Rejuvenate was obviously far better. But John Wick showed us that actually that's not the case. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that here, that you actually are wasting those extra points in Rejuvenate. Getting 150 rage on this Rejuvenate is actually totally wasted because there is a rage cap. You cannot have more than 220 rage per turn. And when you get 150 here, it's 100% almost guaranteed to, except maybe some very rare situations. I think actually it is guaranteed to be wasted because you're always engaged in combat. And if you're engaged in combat attacking another troop, you're going to get 86 rage just from the attack alone if you're winning the fight, right? So that's your base rage. You're getting 86 plus 150. You're already rage capping on that turn no matter what. And in fact, if you get 100 rage plus 86 plus another 16 from the counterattack rage, you're already pretty well close to that rage cap, especially when we consider the fact that you had to have burning blood. So you actually will be rage capping anyway with 2 points in there. So there's really no advantage of having 3 points in Rejuvenate, and that sort of diminished the value of the support tree to some degree once we learned that. Now, support tree does have some other things that are really nice. It has some skill damage reduction and some additional skill damage reduction over here. I think there's some march speed down here. Actually, it looks like it's health, so maybe the march speed, there it is. There's some march speed over here. This is nice if you have healing. A lot of marches don't have healing, so this doesn't really do much. This is also nice when you have healing, but again, because this march, a lot of marches with Joan of Arc won't have healing, this doesn't make sense, although I will give one exception to that here in a moment. So really you end up with mostly looking at the cav tree, and this is a build that I've recommended. I actually recommended in another video several different builds. This is the sort of tankier build because it has a lot of skill damage reduction with this talent emergency protection down here. This is one that I recommended if you like to go into fights and then break off the fight and then go back into the fight and break off the fight. This one that uses Rallying Cry is probably a better choice. And then there's this kind of a meme of a build where we actually go out and put 5 points into Cage of Thorns, recognizing that we're wasting a talent point over here. But getting 5 in Cage of Thorns, and because her active skill fires an extra time, you can get 3 active skills on a skill cycle, and then you'll get 2 active skills, and then you'll get 3 active skills on the next one again. This actually reduces march speed to enemy troops quite a bit. 5 targets, 25% for 3 seconds is pretty powerful, especially if you're firing your cycle maybe every 6 seconds. You can really slow marches down a lot with this one, which is kind of an interesting way to go in certain situations, but probably not the most recommended talent build. So the question here, though, is how to build rage optimal setups with Joan of Arc as the primary commander, particularly when we involve a Horn of Fury. Now, before I get into that, I want to talk about what commanders you might actually be considering using as a secondary to Joan of Arc if you are going to insist on using her as a primary. And I think there's really 3 choices that might make sense here. One, I mentioned already, Nevsky. In certain situations where you are hitting a single target, maybe it makes some sense to have Nevsky as the secondary to Joan of Arc. I'm still not really buying that too much. I think I still actually prefer the Nevsky to be the primary, but nonetheless, maybe that's one option that you're going for. Another option would be the commander Honda Tadakatsu, who just is probably the best secondary commander in the game right now. He just fits with so many different marches. So if you have your Honda expertise, then that really is a requirement for Honda. You really want to have this expertise. He's going to make your Joan of Arc pretty tanky, reducing this normal attack damage by quite a bit, adding more troop capacity, also adding skill damage bonus to her double AoE. Plus, he has a nice AoE skill damage. It's not as big of a damage factor, but it's pretty solid, and it's a very large fan-shaped AoE. And then he adds a whole bunch of attack and a whole lot of march speed, which again, cavalry troops really benefit the most from. And then some more tankiness here, reducing damage taken. He has some extra skill damage that he can do, and actually keeps that march from running away as well, which is also pretty nice. So Joan with Honda actually, to me, makes a lot of sense as a possible pairing. If you were going to put your Joan with Honda, it does make sense to have Joan as the primary and not Honda. All the tests with Honda show that this 1350 rage requirement is just too slow. Marches will target your Honda and they'll just kill it before it even actually has a chance to fire off its skill, which just makes him not really work well as a primary commander. Plus his talent trees, he's got the skill tree, but the other trees are not the greatest. So Joan of Arc Prime as the primary with Honda does make a lot of sense. The other commander, I think it might make sense, and this is sort of a weird one because this would suggest you have this commander in a good spot, but you don't have his natural pair, which is Attila, in a good spot. That would be Takeda Shingen. You could use Joan of Arc Prime with Takeda. There's not necessarily a ton of synergy here. He doesn't really boost skill damage, but he does add quite a bit of tankiness, and he does have some healing, which I think is, yes, this one here. Which might actually be pretty nice with Joan of Arc. I think he had some march speed. Yeah, so some more skill damage reduction taken. And so if you wanted to tank your Joan of Arc Prime, if you found that your Joan of Arc Prime was being targeted a lot as a primary, maybe Takeda Shingen would make some sense. And in that case, you actually would consider, if I could get back up here to my Joan of Arc Prime, in terms of the talent, you would actually consider coming out here to get counterattack because that March actually would have healing and you would benefit from this counterattack's talent. So in that case, if you're pairing with Takeda. So to me, those are really the pairs to think about. I mean, I don't really think it makes sense to go Joan of Arc Prime with Saladin as a secondary. If that's what you're thinking, I would probably put Saladin as the primary in that case. Now, there is another argument for using Joan of Arc Prime as the primary, and that argument is that you want her damage to go first. You want to get that going right away. It is AoE, but keep in mind that this skill over here only activates after the secondary commander. So it's not like she fires the skill and then she fires her skill again. It's she would fire her skill, the secondary commander would fire their skill, and then if this is not in cooldown, you would get Sacred Banner again after that. So I don't really see a ton of benefits of using her as a primary, but if you were using her as a primary, I think those would be the marches that would make sense to do that. So now the question comes, if we're going to use Joan of Arc Prime as a primary commander, what is the right talent tree to build for her? And I've suggested some before, but we wanted to look at some rage optimizations, in particular with Horn of Fury, because Horn of Fury really does change things up a little bit, particularly given that this rage that she's gaining here. So let me jump over to the R script that I've used before for our rage simulator to give you a look at what this script looks like. And I'll just show you. So I'm running my rage simulator. I'm using Joan of Arc Prime as the primary. That's what the number 1 indicates there. She's giving us 20 rage per second for 3 seconds. We have no Horn of Fury in this case, but I can actually add that. But I want to show you what it looks like with no Horn of Fury. And I've got Rejuvenate at 100 because we're putting 2 points there. And both of the other talents are, the rage talents are 9 points. So 3 points in each, 9 total rage. And so if we run that, we get 60 turns of this march, and we notice that it triggers, it gets 1000 rage, hits that requirement here on turn 9, and casts on turn 10. We're getting 100 rage from Rejuvenate, and then on turn 11, 12, and 13, we're getting that 20 rage from Joan of Arc Prime, and then we're seeing her cast that skill again, Sacred Banner. Again, we're getting a pretty quick skill cycle here because we are getting 100 from Rejuvenate, 100 from Rejuvenate, and then another 100 from Rejuvenate again when Sacred Banner is cast again. And again, we're getting this rage, and again, notice here it actually ends up only being 5 turns of rage. You might think, wait, she gets 3 seconds and 3 seconds, right? But the way that the skill timing works and the way the cycles work, it ends up only being that she gets 5 seconds. You get 100 rage, 20 rage per turn for 5 turns in those sort of optimal scenarios. And then, of course, you get these ones with only 30 rage as well. So that's the way the cycle will work for this march. Now, of course, if we add a Horn of Fury, there's a lot more randomness going on, and I'll show you what the results look like for that. But same thing here as we did in the other tests. We ran 10,000 simulations of each of these scenarios. I think I ran 16 scenarios for this one. There's fewer scenarios because we don't have feral nature, so there's really not as many things to manipulate here. But I did actually manipulate how many points we put into Rejuvenate, either 100 or 150, just to demonstrate for you that, at least from a simulation standpoint, we are matching what happens in the game, and that is that there is no effect. And you can notice here that on these Rejuvenate turns, we're hitting 220, Rejuvenate turn 220, Rejuvenate turn 220. Every time we hit Rejuvenate, we're hitting that rage cap of 220. So putting 150 in there doesn't do anything for us, and the simulation bears that out as well. So now let's jump over to the actual results. And here are the 16 different scenarios. We have a rage requirement of 999. I've talked about before why it's not 1,000 because of rounding. We have 9 points in talent 1, and we've manipulated whether or not we're putting points into talent 2. That is the talent in the cav tree, which again, I always forget. I think it's Undying Fury is the name of that talent. We're either putting 0 points, 3 points, 6 points, or 9 points in that talent. We've got Rejuvenate at 100 for each. Obviously, we have Feral at 0 because there's no Feral Nature. That's not a skill on this march, so no Feral Nature. And we've got the Horn of Fury on these first 8. The second 8 tests do not have Horn of Fury, and we are manipulating, again, the talents 0, 3, 6, 9, and we're manipulating Rejuvenate, even though, as you'll see, these are actually identical. They're basically just a repeat of those 10,000 simulations because manipulating Rejuvenate doesn't actually do anything as we've been shown before. Okay, so what can these results tell us? Well, a couple of things stand out. Number one, let's start with no Horn of Fury. Let's start with these last 8 tests, tests 9 through 16. Notice that 100% of the time, our first skill is on turn 10, right? So for those of you who may be new to this kind of video, 7, 8, and 9 refer to the first turn you fire your skill. When do you actually activate your skill? Not trigger it, but actually fire it, cast that skill. And you can see here that 100% of the time it is on turn 10 with this build. It's a fully fixed build. There's nothing else adding rage to us. Now, of course, if you're getting swarmed or you're getting other rage buffs, things will be different. But when in this particular setup, we will cast on turn 10 every single time without a doubt. There is no exception to that. That's why all of these are identical, because again, there's no Horn of Fury, there's no Feral Nature, there's no randomness. That's when we're going to cast our skill. The other thing you'll notice is that the skill cycle is identical. It doesn't matter which of these builds we use. We actually end up with the same skill cycle no matter what, whether we have 2 points, 3 points, 1 point, 0 points in that Undying Fury, we actually end up in the same spot. So what does this mean? This actually means if you do not have a Horn of Fury on your Joan of Arc March, this also, by the way, is true for Saladin if you're running Saladin as a primary. If you don't have that, you're not going to fire your first skill faster than turn 10, and you are going to average a 6.43 second skill cycle. Typically, you're going to have around 6 seconds on your skill cycle. And so you might as well just put no points in those talents. There's no gain by putting points in Undying Fury. So actually you should have a 0 in Undying Fury in that certain circumstance. That would be the recommendation. Again, this assumes you're not being swarmed. This assumes other things aren't happening. If those are happening, maybe this would change a little bit, but for this particular scenario, you're not getting any benefits out of putting points in Undying Fury if you do not have a Horn of Fury on your Joan of Arc Prime March. Now, let's step to the scenario where you have a Horn of Fury, which again, most people recommend in the Season of Conquest as one of the strongest accessories. We see things change quite a bit, right? So if we look at the first skill cast, things change quite a bit, and they change quite a bit as a function of whether we have 0, 3, 6, or 9 points in Undying Fury. And so in fact, Horn of Fury to some extent activates Undying Fury. It actually makes Undying Fury a more valuable talent if you have a Horn of Fury. And so looking at this, we actually see that with no points, we fire off on skill on turn 10 about 55% of the time. So we're about half the time we're actually getting one turn faster by just adding a Horn of Fury to our march, which is pretty incredible when you think about the first turn skill cycle. We also, our skill cycle is a little bit faster too. We're 6.28 seconds per skill cycle versus 6.43 when we have the Horn of Fury on our march. So Horn of Fury, really valuable. That's what these numbers show us here. But then as we start adding talent points, right, we move from 55.63, 55% of the time, let's say, we're firing on turn 10, our first skill, to if we just put 1 point in Undying Fury, we're actually now moving up to 71% of the time we're firing on turn 9, a turn earlier. If we add 2 points, we start adding to turn 8 quite a bit. We go up to 12.5% of the time on turn 8 and 61.5% of the time on turn 9. And finally, if we put 3 points there, we're actually hardly ever firing. Only about 5% of the time now are we firing our first skill on turn 10. So what does all this mean? From my perspective, this means there's actually quite a bit of a boost in having 3 points in Undying Fury if you have the Horn of Fury on your Joan of Arc Prime March. So if you have the Horn of Fury on your Joan of Arc Prime March, I recommend putting all 3 points in Undying Fury and maxing out that rage, because you do seem to get quite a bit of benefit, at least for that first skill. And you can also notice that the skill cycle is quite a bit better, actually. We actually get a pretty big improvement in our skill cycle just for this one, right? So these first 3 don't differ at all, but then this last one does if we put 3 points in that Undying Fury talent. So that's my recommended build if you're going to go with the Horn of Fury on this march. Now, the other thing I want to point out here really briefly, just to show you that it does not matter, notice that these numbers are identical to these numbers here. and that these numbers here are basically identical. They're not quite identical because these are simulations. There is a little bit of randomness to the numbers right above, right? These, and notice that the only change here is rejuvenate. Rejuvenate from 100 to rejuvenate from 150. And I've actually summarized this over here. This is the difference in terms of your percentage gain, in terms of your cycle speed. How much faster is the cycle? And that's where we would expect it, by the way. We wouldn't expect it here on acceleration. Should have talked about that. We would expect it here on the cycle speed because rejuvenate is after the first skill is cast. Nonetheless, the point here is that there's no change. These are, 0.01% difference. That's not 1%, that's 0.01% difference in your cycle speed, which means it's just randomness. This is just differences in the simulations. And of course, when we have a totally fixed situation, it doesn't matter if we put 100 or 150, we get literally identical skill cycles every single time. So that's sort of the simulation results. That's what they suggest to me, that if you are using a Horn of Fury, you want to put all 3 points in that talent build. So now let me jump back over to the setup just to show exactly what I'm talking about with this march. So if this is the march actually that I've recommended before, so this would be the build, or the talent build that I would recommend for Joan of Arc with the Horn of Fury. If you have the Horn of Fury, you want to put 2 points out here and rejuvenate, no more. You want to put 3 points in Undying Fury and max out. And of course, you have to max Burning Blood. So this is the sort of rage optimal build. If you have the Horn of Fury now, you can, if you want, if you prefer this build, that's okay. As long as we're still getting 3 points in Undying Fury and we're still getting 2 points in Rejuvenate, this will work just as optimally from a rage standpoint. And then finally, this one will also work just as optimally from a rage standpoint if you have the Horn of Fury. So all of the builds that I've shown here suggest that are indicative of having the Horn of Fury. You want to have the Horn of Fury, and if you do, you are going to be using Undying Fury. Now, if for some reason you don't have Horn of Fury, if you're pre-Season of Conquest and you don't have access to the Horn of Fury as a legendary accessory, then I would actually recommend not putting any points here. There may be some advantages if you're picking up some counterattack rage because you're being swarmed, or there may be some advantages if you are picking up some rage from some other buffs nearby. And by the way, obviously I'm talking about pre-Season of Conquest, which means I'm actually not talking about Joan of Arc Prime here. I'm really talking about Saladin, who has these same 2 trees. So if you have Saladin and you don't have the Horn of Fury, it's probably not much benefit to you to be using Undying Fury. Or if you're in the Season of Conquest, you have Joan of Arc Prime, you're using her as a primary commander. Again, I don't really recommend it, but let's say you are. If you don't have the Horn of Fury, then you can probably skip the points in Undying Fury as well. So that's it. That's the way to think about Joan of Arc Prime as a primary commander. Her best pairings are probably Nevsky as the secondary, which seems a little suspect to me. I would probably prefer Nevsky as the primary. Honda Tadakatsu is a clear case for you would use him as a secondary commander, and possibly Takeda Shingen as well. Otherwise, I really recommend using Joan of Arc Prime as a secondary commander. But if you do use her as a primary commander, you want to know if you have a Horn of Fury or not. If you have the Horn of Fury, max out your points over here in Undying Fury. And if you don't have the Horn of Fury, you can probably skip those points and put them somewhere else. That's it for this video. I hope you learned something, and if you did, give the video a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment down below if you want to hear more about these kinds of setups. What other commanders do you want to hear about? I've been doing a lot on Joan of Arc Prime lately, but I'm happy to take a look at other commanders as well. Thanks so much for coming by, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one.